private equity, both dedicated funds and independent sponsors, make themselves more attractive to entrepreneurs. And I think from one perspective, it comes down to two things. One, taking a long view. I'll go back to that in a second. And the second is creating a relationship. And of course, they're both related. The most success we've seen with our funds and independent sponsors is when they take the time to get to know somebody, not just them and their business, but them as individuals. You know, what are their goals? Where are they in their lives? For many of these people, you know, this is their baby. It's their love. It's where they go every day. To some extent, it's their reason for existence. And they need to feel that the private equity folks are not just there to make a buck, but that they're willing to take the time. And sometimes that takes years. It takes getting to know them over time. It's getting, you know, to sit down and have a meal, to go visit them, to understand their goals, both personally and professionally, and to let them come to the conclusion that these are the right people. And we've certainly seen many situations where the entrepreneur founder will choose our client, not because they're the highest price, but because they think they're the best fit. They think they're the people that will take care of their employees, that will look out for the business from a long-term perspective, not just load on a lot of debt, not just carve things up, but will really continue, you know, again, their baby. And that's when we've seen it work successfully, and we've seen it work to the detriment of others, even who are paying more. So with that, Jeff, maybe I'll stop talking for a few minutes.
Thanks, Lloyd. Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with pretty much everything you say. I mean, we work with, like I said, a ton of private equity, a ton of strategics, and you know, we've seen deals die for a variety of reasons, and it's usually to your point where, you know, there's either a cultural difference or the sellers just don't feel like the buyer has their best interest in mind. You know, our work, like I said earlier, whether it's a strategic or private equity, is really the same from a financial diligence and tax diligence perspective. But I think there still is the stigma of, you know, private equity just wants to come in, you know, cut headcount, improve cash flows, and then turn around and sell the business in 2 or 3 years. And while some firms that may be the case, for a lot of firms that's not the case, and they do want to grow with the business and develop a long-term and mutually beneficial arrangement with the sellers and the founders. Now, sometimes the founders don't have any intention to continue, and so, you know, their goals and their you know, ideals of what a deal should look like might be different than a CEO or an owner that wants to continue. And so I think if you have kind of a bifurcation of the companies that, you know, where you look at where the CEO just wants out and they want to hit the golf course, you know, they may not necessarily care as much, but it's, to your point, Lloyd, it's still their baby and they still want to turn it over to someone that's going to take care of it. And so I think at the end of the day, all your points are valid. And we do see deals die because of that, because where the seller just does not feel like the private equity firm has their best intentions in mind. And usually that's on the sell side. So when we're doing a sell side, you know, we do see those deals fall apart for those reasons, and we do get the debrief. Usually on the buy side, we're really not hearing the reasons why the private equity firm just says, you know, the seller backed away. But certainly there are differences in the approach and what private equity looks for. And I think Ajay and Reed can talk to that. But, you know, things like customer concentration and projections are all certainly very important for private equity, as they are for a strategic. But usually for a strategic, they have synergies in mind and they know, you know, what the business does, and they're just adding a product line. So they more are concerned with, you know, just make sure there's no red flags in here that we're not aware of. Where private equity, you know, they want to make sure that the EBITDA levels hold up for their lenders. And so there certainly are different ways and approaches that a private equity firm will come to a deal that a strategic may not. But certainly agree with a lot of what you said, Lloyd. And so Ajay and Reed, I'll hand it over to you for further thoughts here.
So I just shared some thoughts. We have a slightly different perspective because we're representing, basically we're representing sellers for the most part. And when we talk to private equity firms, as opposed to directly dealing with an entrepreneur, you're going through an investment banker who has other thoughts and so on and so forth. We have a Rolodex of private equity firms, who've reached out to us or we know of, or we can see through PitchBook and so on and so forth. And the challenge a little bit is that if we look through and we say we want to find a strategic for a particular company, we can narrow it down fairly well. We can get a short list of strategics. And we want to look at the private equity firms. We've got a long, long list of firms that show up in our database. And everyone wants to deal with, for example, you look at software, there's probably 1,000 private equity firms or more that would deal with software. Growing companies, 20% or more, 3 million or more in EBITDA, So all those criteria you normally see in a private equity site, things like that, you check all those boxes and you still have too many firms. So how do we narrow it down, and what makes a difference? One of the things is that I think Lloyd first brought up. It's not just price. The way we look at it, actually, it's the two most important things that a seller also looks at is, in addition to price, it's the certainty of closing. And so what they're trying to, no one wants to go into an LOI process. You guys, a private equity firm doesn't want to either. Go through the process, spend all the time and energy, and then find out at the end of the day that there's a particular factor that you're not going to close because of that, for whatever reason. So the kinds of things that we want to know about is things like, and to go through a quick overview, most low middle market companies, that 3 to 10 million or 20 million in EBITDA, they're not Ford models. They've got a blemish or two. Do you want to? Are you willing to deal with things like customer concentration? Just as an example, we just entered an LOI with a strategic acquirer for a client with 70% customer concentration. 70%. That's typically a pretty much a death knell for a private equity deal, right? Now, what's the flip side of it? They're growing 50% a year. So there's that aspect. Management change. We often love representing founder-led companies. It's really, really important for us to know, are you willing to, and the entrepreneurs, either they're close to retirement age, or they may be mid-career, but they're not necessarily looking to stay on for a full 5-year private equity life cycle. So, and we tell entrepreneurs as well, you can't sell your business and leave day one. So we're not talking about that. What we're talking about is that, are you willing to, and it's good to mention up front, hey, we're a private equity buyer, but we'll work with founders who want to leave in a year or two, right? So we'll deal with management positions. Are there gaps? There may be gaps in the management team. Are you willing to deal with that? We had a client where there's no salespeople. The only salesperson is the entrepreneur, and he wants to leave in a year or two. Reality is that he has a team of people who handle the day-to-day post-sale account management. So it's not, just one person with all the customer relationships. But these are the types of things that we want to know about. Lender contingencies. Are you willing to say, hey, look, for the sectors I'm interested in, and it's good to know if you have specific subsectors, say, I'm willing to offer no lender contingency. You're the guys with the capital, whether you have a one-stop shop, whether you have whatever, other sources of enough sources of mezz or debt capital that you can tap into. That's one of the things, because it's not just having the contingency; it's what other things that lender puts into, items in their checklist that cause issues. If you have a platform, we look at for the most part, if you've got a platform, when we do our search, we'll look for private equity firms with a platform, and we'll look at them as close to strategics, not necessarily exactly the same, because you may still have a certain private equity lens that you put on top of it. But oftentimes you do look at the strategic benefit. So that's really important. So the most important things for you to tell us is, hey, I've got these 3 platforms that I want add-ons on, and it doesn't matter whether it's a 3 million, 10 million, 20 million add-on. We know there's a high chance of closure once there's a strategic fit, even if the add-on is bigger than your platform for whatever reason. Do you have an investment thesis in a specific subsector? If you call me up, I had a private equity firm called me up the other day and says, look, I'm interested in acquiring a managed IT services company with a specialty in security services, right? We'll deal with founder transition, we'll management transition, we'll deal with if it's not small enough and if it's got some customer concentration, because we're looking at a roll-up strategy. Well, gee, now that's much more specific, and I can match that up and say, hey, as opposed to just saying we're interested in IT services in general and so on and so forth, growing, 3 million EBITDA and growing 20% a year, whatever that metric is. So just these are things that we look at, and that's why I thought I'd share. I'd like to turn it over to Reed. I'm sure he has great thoughts to add here.
Well, before you step in, Reed, Ajay, if you find that company, I'd like to see it too.
Okay.
Great. Yeah, that was a good list, AJ. Thank you. I don't want to go over the same thoughts that he has presented, but his were very good. So I've come up with some that are a little bit different. I want to start off by saying that we've done about 100 transactions with private equity firms, and we found that they're very, very expert at courting entrepreneurs and courting other buyers also, whether they're strategics or or even their private equity brethren. So some of the things I'm going to talk about are things that they're already many of the private equity firms are already doing, but let me just share with you some of the things that have resonated with our clients. Well, in a lot of cases, we might start off with an entrepreneur who has never sold a business before. He or she may have talked to other entrepreneurs they know about a sales process. Sometimes we even find that they've been told that selling to private equity is a red flag, don't do it, I had a bad experience or whatever. So a lot of times what we want to do is we want to size up the business, who the buyer opportunities are for that business. And then we might have to convince the seller, the entrepreneur, to be open to private equity buyers and explain why not all private equity deals are going to go wrong. In fact, I think if deals go wrong, they go wrong as much in the strategic sector as they do in private equity. It's just that private equity is very unknown to a lot of entrepreneurs, and it's getting in to an area that they're uncomfortable with. Again, part of our job is to make them more comfortable. But let me tell you a couple of things that I think have resonated well with sellers that we've worked with. First of all, it's important that the private equity firm, in discussions they're having with the sellers, let them know that you really understand their business. You really see what they're doing and you get it. You're not just buying EBITDA, and you really like what they're doing. You're not going to get, when we run a process, or most other investment banks run a process, you're not going to get a lot of time to get to know the other, sellers, because we're going to run a very controlled process and limit access, particularly in the earlier stages. But usually in the management meeting or in some phone calls that may occur, that's a good time to make the case that you really understand their business. We have had private equity firms come to management meetings unprepared, and it's been very noticeable to the sellers. That's been a big negative, so that's on the list of what not to do. One of the ways to really differentiate yourselves is to bring with you an operating executive who knows the industry and can talk the same language as the seller. That works really well. We've had other situations where the private equity firm has come with an advantage that they're bringing to the seller post-transaction. We did a deal about 2 years ago with Bertram Capital. Bertram has something called the Bertram Labs, where they have software engineers and other folks who will help you with your technology and your digital strategy. If you're a portfolio company within Bertram, that was very attractive to the seller that we ended up closing the deal with Bertram. So there are things like that that can really differentiate you from strategic buyers and also from other private equity firms. I think it's important to share what the future of the business might look like under your ownership as a private equity firm. You know, how many board seats everybody will have, how much oversight and reporting there will be, and also how you can kind of help the company. The company, and a lot of times when they do a deal with private equity, it's because they're attracted to the growth potential that can come for their business through acquisitions, through funding internal growth. And a lot of times, one of the big advantages is that the private equity firm has expertise in raising capital. They can make all those things happen that the entrepreneur was unable to do on his or her own. So put those things forward as you're making your case. Also, you know, private equity firms are going to require entrepreneurs to roll part of their equity. It could be 20%, it could be 45%, or, you know, somewhere in that range. Again, it's very important to explain to the sellers what their return on their next bite at the apple is going to look like. Because a lot of them, when we start off, they want that next bite of the apple. They want to partner with a private equity firm that can help them on the finance side, help them perhaps by hiring a CFO that'll work within the company, that'll be, you know, again, better positioned to kind of help the company grow. And then there are certainly some things that we do see that are important to sellers. A lot of times a seller wants to keep his or her management team intact after the acquisition. Strategics often can't do that. They might go in and wipe out the top management because they've already got people in those positions. That may be attractive to the strategic because of the cost synergies, but it may not be attractive to the seller who wants to protect long-time employees, particularly at the senior level, who have helped build the business and create the value. So private equity firms a lot of times can offer that as an advantage. They'll see the company perhaps as a platform for growing and adding other acquisitions. That'll be exciting for the current management team. Another thing that sometimes is important is benefits. Again, strategics are more likely to come in and say, well, we've already got our benefit program, so you're going to be on our same program for healthcare and 401k and everything else. And when the seller starts to look at it, it's not as attractive as the current programs the seller has. So that can be a negative selling to a strategic. On the other hand, if the private equity firm continues to maintain those programs, that's a real positive. I actually had one deal many years ago where the seller decided not to do a deal because of the change in the benefits the buyer was going to impose. A year later, the buyer came back. The buyer agreed to allow the current benefits to stay in place for 3 years for all employees, but was going to buy the company at a somewhat reduced purchase price, enough really to cover the cost of those savings that they would have had from the benefits. The seller agreed to do the deal. He was happy to, you know, if he lost, say, $1 million on purchase price, but his employees were protected for 3 years, that was the turning point in getting the deal done. You know, I think, you know, in general, you know, sellers are thinking about their legacy. They want their company to continue. Sometimes retaining the name is important. A lot of times private equity buyers can do that and are better positioned to do it than strategics who may come in right away, absorb the company, and the name is long gone. So those are some of the things. Happy to take questions along with Ajay if you'd like, and thanks for giving us the chance to present.
AJ and Reed, that was really, and forgive me, and Jeff, that was really terrific, and we appreciate all your insightful comments. Would love to take some questions from the participants if anyone has one. I'm hoping someone does.
Yeah, this is Michael Fellman. Hopefully Jeff will back me up on this, but I think when an entrepreneur comes to a family office, it's a very different mindset than if it goes to a private equity firm. Not to knock private equity firms. I know there's a number on this webinar, but at least from our experience, you know, we you know, when you have a family office behind you, there is a certain cachet that you don't get necessarily when there's a private equity. So for example, the Pritzker Group, which is not part of our group, but you know, if you have the Pritzker Group behind you, that carries a lot of weight, not just in the terms of the deal, but what can happen going forward. Because given their history in operating companies, I think a lot of entrepreneurs find that very attractive. And a lot of times, although we do venture in the TMT space, in other sectors that we invest in real estate and energy, is more private equity, either growth to buyout. And we've won a number of deals over some very big private equity firms such as Blackstone and KKR, because of the fact that our clients have been in those industries for decades, and gives the entrepreneur some, you know, everybody says value add, which sometimes to me can be overblown, but really, if you look at the particular, you know, what the particulars are, I think that becomes very, very attractive, particularly to a first-time entrepreneur, when someone who's considered a titan in the industry, you know, looks to get involved with your company. And that's, I don't know if Jeff has the same feeling on that, but you know, that's the way we've won our deals. We don't participate in auctions, and at least when we do private equity, that's been our story. So.
Yeah, Michael, just to step in there, absolutely agree. You know, that at the end of the day, more traditional private equity firms, I think, are more focused on the spreadsheets, more focused on the returns when they're making their decisions. And certainly when they approach a founder or entrepreneur, you know, as a family office, and certainly we're focused on lower middle market and the really partnering, you know, with those entrepreneurs and those founders, as opposed to viewing them as a seller. You know, we view them as a partner for the future. And by taking more of an operating mindset in those initial discussions, as well as frankly presenting yourself and working at and rolling up your sleeves to be there, an extension of the management team, being able to provide value in terms of expanding the breadth of what they can do. At the end of the day, there's a lot of money out there in the world. What you can't build is more time to the day. And most entrepreneurs and founders, they have vast expectations for the growth of a business. What they don't have is the bandwidth to actually capture all those opportunities, particularly if you're thinking about a strategic consolidation strategy. They may think there's some fabulous opportunities to go buy businesses, but frankly, they don't have either the expertise or, more importantly, the time to do it. I mean, every time we approach a business, it's like, how can we help you? What's the value add that we can bring to you? Not just the money, but the expertise from our operating executives and their experiences in growing businesses, and then, you know, our team to help them actually execute it.
I agree. I mean, every investment we make, if you just want our money, we're not interested. We're really not interested. Even on the venture side, we're not interested. It's like, what can we bring to the table besides money? And in many cases, it's a long Rolodex. It's a history of being in that industry for not just 5 years, 10 years, but 20, 30, 40, in some cases, 50 years. That's something that's an intangible that you just can't find, at least in my opinion, you can't find in most circumstances. And I think that's why you're seeing family offices getting pitched more and more from entrepreneurs. So that's my 2 cents. But
Hey, Lloyd,
Bob,
can
I
you
know
hear me?
you have a question. I think you wanted
Sorry.
to ask something. Oh, forgive me, Michael.
that's okay. I'm done.
Yeah, thanks. Hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, and then also, and then after, I think Michelle, my Chicago, has a question. My question is, I think, Reed, your commentary was good. Both things are private. I was curious as to, the approach could be directly from the family office or from the portfolio co. If it's a portfolio co proposal, I was curious if you have nuanced different strategies, if it's a private strategic or if it's a public strategic, because frankly, a smart process is going to be talking to family office, public and private situations, just from fiduciary duty basis. So I was curious if you or another panelist comments on the public versus private type bidder. And then, like I said, Michelle had a question.
What was that?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and go first. So when we're looking at prospective buyers, if a private equity firm or a family office already has a portfolio company in the space and they're likely to be the buyer, we pretty much treat that buyer as a strategic, or we think about that buyer as a strategic, not so much as being owned by private equity or a family office. And then we certainly, and then I would say we don't really think too hard about selling to a privately held buyer versus publicly held, unless there's stock involved in the transaction. And then of course you've got to value what the buyer's going to get in terms of that consideration. But we don't, when we do deals with publicly held companies, it's generally for cash. Most of our transactions are in the $25 million to $150 million range, and so it's less likely that there will be a stock component. Ajay?
Yeah, I second what Reed is saying. Is we look at pretty much any firm that has a portfolio company. If it's private, whether it's a private equity firm, whether it's a family fund, whatever, as a strategic. And if it's a private strategic, we do try to find out a little bit just to make sure they have access to capital. And as long as they have access to capital, that's for acquisitions. That's pretty much the key criteria, and we treat them, all strategics in general, fairly equally. Other things being equal, one could be more strategic than another. That kind of thing. One interesting thing, Michael did bring something up important about family funds. We do look at family funds, particularly those that say, hey, we have let's call it an indefinite hold period mindset, as different from a limited time hold period mindset, because the entrepreneur views that differently. And they do look at, I guess, what the buyer may do with the business on a longer term basis, and what their legacy will be. And those are the types of things that I think matter in terms of other things being equal, the bids being close or similar. Those are the things that get a founder to lean towards one party or the other.
Maybe I'll jump in here with another question. Given COVID and given the kind of the uncertainty around getting back to projections and expectations, especially in the services end of TMT and other industries, have you seen seller expectations change at all? Has there been a softening? Has there been movement on that side? All other things being equal for now.
Well, we're seeing a lot of sellers that are going to market that have sailed through COVID with better results than they had before. There could be a variety of reasons. In some cases, if it's media, the consumers are actually consuming more media during COVID, so their results are up. If they're a subscription product or something, again, their results are up. So those tend to be the folks that are hiring us now, folks that have better results during COVID than they had previously. Maybe they cut their costs, their salespeople didn't travel, they didn't spend as much on event sponsorships and all kinds of things that they were doing, going to trade shows. So if anything, I think the sellers think they're going to get more money, and the buyers think we have to make an adjustment for COVID because when things go back to normal, you're not going to maintain that same expense structure, and you probably won't be getting the benefit of of more consumers, relying on you, because they had extra time during COVID. So there's that, tension that will come in, and we're seeing it. There is a COVID adjustment that buyers are already talking about, and I would say that comes up almost in every deal now, because buyers want to understand what the business is going to look like post-COVID, and they want to buy the business based on how that business is going to perform post-COVID, not during COVID.
Yeah, I second that. I think being focused on the tech industry in general, most of the companies are growing, and some of them have growing very rapidly. And so buyers are asking that question. We try to, bring realistically, for many of the companies we're dealing with, it's not as variable maybe because it's less pure media focused or whatever. So we think a lot of the trends for some of these companies like industrial IoT will continue post-COVID. And while growth may be a little slower, they may not jump as high, those sales won't disappear. But buyers are definitely asking, just like Reed mentioned, they're looking for a COVID adjustment the other way, but because these companies are doing so well, they want to make sure that it's not a one-time bump in revenues and EBITDA.
Yeah, and I'll just chime in here quickly, and then I do have to jump from that call. But I think when we look at the COVID impact, a lot of these companies in the software space are based on, buyers care about recurring revenue, whether it's monthly or annual. And I think, some of those trends are now just starting to show up, because a lot of these customers are under contract. And so, if there was a loss of a customer, you may not have seen that until June or July or August or even later in 2020. And so when we start to come in and we look at trends, that recurring revenue doesn't really start to dip until late 20. And so that is a big piece of what we focus on, especially with private equity clients, is to understand the trends in recurring revenue, because that's what they care about. I don't know if it's strategic necessarily would focus on that, but they should. So it's just an interesting juxtaposition with a lot of other industries where you have that kind of cutoff in March of April of 20 that you may not necessarily see with a true technology or SaaS business until later in the year. So just some insight that we've started to see. But.
Well, Lloyd, do you want to close it off, because people are jumping off, and I know people have places to be and things to do. So I want to thank AJ and Reed and Lloyd and Jeff. Lloyd, if there's anything that you want to do to finish it off and leave us with an inspiring message about TMT and how it's going to.
I'll leave with an inspiring message of sooner rather than later, it seems that we'll be able to do these in person. And that was always a phenomenal thing to do, especially at Marianne's Loft, especially on the rooftop on a nice spring or summer or fall evening with a great view. So I look forward to seeing everybody soon, because that seems like it's going to happen.